Welcome to the How to Program with Java podcast, where all you need is the desire to learn, and you too can become a Java programmer with absolutely no knowledge of programming. And now, your host, Trevor Page.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 8 of the How to Program with Java podcast. Thank you very much for joining us. And today we have probably one of my favorite topics to cover, and that is arrays. Now, arrays are very, very, very useful in programming, and they make all of our lives a lot easier. So I always love to talk about them. So let's do that. Let's dive right into the content. All right. So first, I'll talk about a little bit about why I think arrays are so useful. And then I'm going to go over some important things to note about arrays, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about something called a multidimensional array, which sounds fancy, but it's really pretty straightforward. Okay, so let's talk about why they're useful. Well, first of all, it really helps to reduce the sheer amount of code that you actually write, because when you are using an array, what you're actually doing is using a whole bunch of variables, and they're just kind of smashed together. Okay? So, in other words, you're reducing the amount of code that you need to type out in such a way that you would have to, declare or initialize and instantiate tons and tons and tons of variables. Okay? So one way I like to think of an array is kind of in the format of an address book. And I've touched on this, I think, before in one of the earlier episodes, but I'll go back to it just to refresh your memory a little bit. If you think of an address book, think of a physical address book where you have pages in a book, and you have people's names and addresses and telephone numbers written on each page. So let's say you have your sister's contact information on page 1, you have your brother's contact information on page 2, you have your parents' contact information on page 3, etc., 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 okay? So it's very important to think of an array in terms of blocks, or like I said, pages, okay? Page 1, page 2, page 3, because that's essentially each page represents the piece of data that you want to know about or that you want to store and use, okay? In this case, it's the address of whomever. So you take all of these potentially variables in their own right and put them together into one variable, okay? And it's the array, okay? So, and these things, they're very flexible, and you can do fun things like you can sort the arrays. So if you were to put information into an array, you put in all these contacts in your address book, which is an address book variable, let's say, in your program. You put all these contacts in there, and then with one line of code, you can choose to sort the entire array, say by first name or by last name, or by phone number, or by whatever way you want to sort it. You can actually tell the Java code to sort it by that field, okay? So it's really powerful stuff, and really flexible and useful, and this is why I love arrays so much, okay? Now, they're also very commonly used in Java and in any programming language, okay? I always say, this is the foundation of programming, and this is so important, and for the most part, all of that is true. But I really think arrays are really the backbone of programming in general. I think without them, you wouldn't have nice, flexible and easy to read code. Okay, that's my statement, and I'm sticking to it. So let's talk about things that are special about arrays, things that you should sort of note, things that you should keep in mind whenever you want to use these things. Okay, The first thing, and probably the most obvious thing when you actually get into the coding, is that arrays have a different syntax than if you were to just randomly declare a whole bunch of variables. So let's be a little bit more concrete. I have an address book of 10 people. I have 10 people in my address book. And if you were not using an array, you would have 10 different variables that you would need to declare. Okay? And one special thing about Java, well, I shouldn't say Java, any programming language, is that you need to assign a name to a variable. Okay, we've talked about variables before, and we've talked about their own syntax. You have the variable's type, like string or integer or something, followed by the name of the variable, okay, what you want to use to reference that variable. And then you need to actually give it a value or assign a value to that variable. So one thing that's special to note is that you are not allowed to have two variables with the same name. Okay? So that's significant because if you have a contact or an address book of contacts and you have 10 contacts inside of your address book, you're going to have to create 10 different variables, and then you'd have to give those variables 10 different names. So usually, if you were to do this, any probably sane person would give it, a variable name followed by 1, the same variable name followed by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you know what I mean? Contact 1, contact 2, contact 3, etc. So that would be the names of all your variables. And then if you ever wanted to reference that information in some way, shape, or form, like you want to know if, inside of all your contacts, if you have the contact for, your best friend or something. Let's say Nathan. So you need to go through each of those variables that you've created, those 10 variables, and you need to look and see if any of those variables have the contents of, Nathan's address or Nathan's phone number, okay? And that is a giant pain in the butt. You'd have to type out, if contact 1 equals, or contact 1 dot name equals Nathan, then go ahead and do this. Or check if contact 2 dot name equals Nathan, then do this. Or contact 3 dot name equals Nathan, then do. It's just ridiculous. It just doesn't work. And what happens if you wanted to add another contact into your address book? Well, you've only typed out 10 variables. Contact 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way to 10. Now you need to add an 11th variable, so then you need to go back, declare the variable, contact 11, and then think of all the places in your code where you referenced all this information about contact variables, and checking to see if it had the contents name of Nathan. Well, now you need to go back and add contact 11, and do all the code related to that, and it would just be a nightmare. Okay. So obviously I'm making that situation sound very dire and very bad because it is, and because, arrays are the solution. Okay? So there is light at the end of that tunnel. So having said that, yes, arrays have a different syntax than declaring a whole bunch of variables. And that's something that you'll see I have in the show notes at howtoprogramwithjava.com/session8. You'll see at the bottom in the homework section, I have a link to an article that I wrote up, just describing arrays, and you'll see the syntax in there. It's similar to the syntax that you've seen before for creating a variable. Okay, it's the same kind of concept. You have your variable type that you need to declare. You have a variable name that you need to give it, and then the only other thing that's different is you need to give a size for the array. So the size is important for arrays because Java needs to know before the program runs how many sort of pages or how many slots or indexes there should be in the array before you actually run the program so that it can do its own thing. Now, that doesn't exactly add up with the scenario I was talking about before, because before I said, well, what happens if you had to add an 11th contact and you only had declared 10 variables? Well, it's just kind of the same situation here, right? If I just said that an array, you need to define the size of the array before you can run your program, well, that doesn't really help, because what if you assign the size of 10 and then you wanted to add an 11th contact? Okay, can you do that? Well, what you can do is you can use something called an array list. Okay, so it's a different data type altogether, but this array list allows you to have an array that can grow and shrink at will. Okay, if you want, you can declare your array list with an initial size capacity. If you know that it's going to be about 10, in size, 10 pages, 10 whatevers in size, then you can say that, but it won't be held won't be written in stone. You will be able to subtract, remove contacts from your address book that's stored in your array list, or you can add 100 more. And it's completely up to you. You can even declare the array list without a size at all, because maybe you have no idea what size or however many pages or whatever you're going to be putting into your contact address book. Then you can just declare it as empty and no size limit, and it'll be fine with that. So Java handles that. Just to recap what I just said, arrays, you need to define an actual size, okay, an initial capacity. But if you use an array list, you don't need to specify the actual size constraint on your array list, okay? Now, then you would ask, well, why wouldn't you just always use an array list? Well, because sometimes you're in a situation where you know that the size of the array is not going to change. It's going to be 10, and it's always going to be 10, and that's just the way it is. And, if it ever does change, then you would just change that code yourself, and it wouldn't change during the run time of the actual application. So then it would be a good idea to actually use an array, because I'm sure there's some little bit of speed that you can gain in your actual application code, because Java will be able to use that more efficiently, and la 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 and all that stuff. But in the grand scheme of things, if you're creating a program that's not a massive scale enterprise application that you're going to be using, on the scale of Microsoft or Facebook or something like that, then choosing an array list over an array is probably a wise choice, and it could save you some headaches. Okay, again, that's just my opinion. I'm sure the one thing that is sure of in the programming arena is that every programmer is going to have an opinion, and they're going to make sure that they share that opinion with you. So do some research, and whatever you feel most comfortable with, then go ahead. I'm just giving you the information and what I do personally in my programming at home. Then that's just what I do, and that's what I'm sharing with you. So take that with a grain of salt, if you will. All right. So next I want to talk about something called the bounds of the array. Okay. So the bounds of the array are important, because you don't ever want to go out of bounds with the array. Just like in golf, if you shoot your golf shot and it goes out of bounds, you have to put an extra stroke on your score. It's the same kind of concept here. If you go out of the bounds of the array, Java will get upset and it will throw an exception, and your code will crash unless you have some way to handle it. Okay. So what are these bounds I'm talking about? Well, it's the size. Okay. So if you have an array that's size is 10, then you don't want to try to retrieve information from the 11th page of the array, okay? Because if you try to retrieve information from the 11th slot or the 11th index of the array, Java won't know what to do. And when Java doesn't know what it should do, it throws an exception, and your code will crash, okay? So it's important to stay inside of the bounds. So when does this happen? This concept I'm talking about of staying within the bounds. This happens when you're actually going to retrieve the data from the array. Okay? And I haven't talked about this yet. I probably should have a little bit earlier, but let me do that now. With an array, you can store information in the array, and you can retrieve the information from the array. So I can have an array of size 10, and I put into each slot of the array, okay, I have 10 pages like I have in my address book, I'm going to physically put in the information into each slot of the array. Okay, so this is known as the actual index of the array. And let me start using that terminology, okay? The index of the array. When you store 10 pieces of information into the array, each individual piece of information, each individual piece of data will have an index, okay? And the array itself is actually something called a zero-based array or zero-based indexing system. Okay, Java does this for a lot of its data types, and I've grown fond of it only because I've seen it so many times and I'm just used to the whole thing. But if I'm sure if I went back to my roots as a programmer back when I first started, I would say, well, why the heck do they use a zero-based index system? So what is a zero-based index system? Well, all that means is that the first item in your array, okay, if you put something in your array, the first item, and you want to retrieve that first item from the array, the position of that item is at position 0. So if you have an array, you say, okay, address book dot get 0. Okay, get me the 0th element. And you would think it doesn't really make sense because get me the 0th element feels like you're saying get me, something that doesn't exist. But it does, and that's what the zero-based index system is all about. The 0th element is the first element. The first index number 1, is the second element. Index number 2 is the third element. Okay, index 3, fourth element. You get what I'm saying here? So if I had an array that had 10 items in it, the index or the bounds of the array would be from index 0 to index 9. Okay? Remember, 10 items. 0 is the first item. 1 is the second. 2 is the third. All the way to 9th is the 10th item. Okay? 0 through 9. 10 items. And that's something that when you're new to programming and you've never seen this before, it tricks you. Because I know this because I've done this before. You go to retrieve, you want to get the first item inside of your array, and you say, okay, well, get me 1, get me the first element, and you say .get 1 or whatever the syntax is, and let's say I only have 1 item in my array because I'm just playing around with it. I only put 1 thing in it. I immediately get an exception, and the exception is array index out of bounds exception. And it's out of bounds because there's only 1 element in the array, and I'm asking for element 1, which is actually the second element, which doesn't exist, so you get the error, okay? So I can't stress that part enough. If you've never seen a zero-based indexing system before, it's probably going to bite you in the butt, but you'll get used to it. It took me a little while, but you'll remember if you screw up enough times, then you're going to learn from your mistakes and make sure it doesn't happen. So that's a kind of an interesting thing with arrays, and you just got to look out for it. Okay, you don't want to go out of bounds, otherwise you'll see the array index out of bounds exception. Okay, so I've talked about the syntax of arrays. They're a little bit different from declaring a whole bunch of variables. I've talked about the fact that you can get errors when you go out of bounds of the array. I've told you that arrays come in different forms. Okay, arrays versus array lists. Okay, and I've talked about the fact that arrays are a zero-based system. Okay, so now let me talk about something a little bit more complex, and this is called the multidimensional array. So what in the heck is a multidimensional array? Well, first you need to understand what an array is, which we've been talking about. But now I want you to think of an array visually, okay? Think of an array as a single line of information, okay? So in that one line has slots, right? The indexes, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, okay? So you have 10 slots horizontally laid out, okay? Each slot is, equally spaced apart, okay, along one line. Well, if you think about an array in that fashion, then a multi-dimensional array is just that same concept of having that one row, that one line of data, but you just multiply it in such a way that you give more lines, more rows of data, okay? So a good way to visually represent this would be to think of something like a crossword puzzle, okay? A crossword puzzle has letters laid out in rows and columns, okay? That is exactly what a multi-dimensional array does, what it looks like, okay? You have sort of, or at least I'm saying multi-dimensional. What I just described there is actually a two-dimensional array, which is a type of multi-dimensional array. So it's 2 dimensions because there's an X and a Y, okay? We have rows and we have columns, okay? So if you want to, I like the crossword puzzle example because I can physically, you can see in your mind, you can write out the letters of a crossword puzzle. You can write them out, and each of those letters could be represented by an index, okay? So you could have at index 0, 0, which is the top left-hand corner, you'd have a letter. And at 0, 1, okay, you'd have another letter. Or you can be at 1, 1, okay? Another way to think about it is, if you remember way back in math class, there were these things called matrices, okay? You'd have a matrix of numbers, okay? And it would have the same X and Y coordinate for each number, okay? Multi-dimensional arrays, or more specifically a two-dimensional array, is exactly like that, okay? All that it does is it has this number-based system, okay? These indexes, the sort of X and Y, that you can use to represent a position inside of the array. Now that pointer, or that system that you use to reference a specific spot on the array, is just that. It's just the way that you can use to reference the spot. But when the magic happens is the data that's actually resides inside of that spot, okay? If it's a crossword puzzle, then the data that resides in the spot is just a letter, okay? If it's a matrix, then the data is just a number, okay? A string versus an integer. But it doesn't have to be that. It could be an entire object if you like, okay? You can have a matrix or a multi-dimensional array of users if you really want to. User at position 0, 0, user at position 3, 15, user at position whatever, okay? I don't exactly know why you'd want to do that, but who knows? You might have a situation that you run into that requires you to actually declare it like that. Now that's a two-dimensional array, and I'm talking about multi-dimensional arrays. So what about a three-dimensional array? Can you do that? Well, you can, and then you're talking about thinking about data, or thinking about the actual multi-dimensional array in terms of a three-dimensional cube, okay? So you'd have 3 different sort of axes or axes, or whatever the plural of the word axis is. You'd have 3 different axes that you would need to refer to get to the data at that position. I guess an X, a Y, and a Z coordinate, okay? And I mean, I've never used a 3-dimensional array. I really very, very rarely would use a 2-dimensional array. And I frequently use a single-dimensional array, or just a regular array, okay, or an array list. So I just want to talk a little bit about multi-dimensional arrays because I wanted to make sure that you were aware that they existed, but I also want you to be aware that they are not commonly used, okay? You can certainly read up on multi-dimensional arrays and the common uses of them, because I'm sure if you looked up the common use of it, then you would be able to know that you would need to use a multidimensional array if you were ever faced with a programming problem that that related to what you read about with respect to when you would use a multidimensional array. Because if someone has a common use for them, then maybe they are very useful to solve that particular problem. So, good to know that they exist, and good to be up to speed on when is a good time to use a multidimensional array. Now, to sort of move, to shift sort of in parallel to a multidimensional array, another tidbit that I want to throw in here is there's a different way to use a multidimensional array in Java programming, and there's a more common way to use it in such a way that it's more useful, okay? And it's called something called a map, okay? And a map is neat because it has a key and a value. So it's similar to a multidimensional array in that you have a certain position that you can reference, and when you reference that position, you get some sort of data. But the actual key doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be something in a linear fashion. It doesn't have to be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. The key could be, it could be a number. I mean, it could be 1, 6, 14, whatever. But the key could even be just a string. It could be a sentence. It could be a name. How about this for an example? You can have a map where, let's say you have a bunch of cars, okay? The makes and models of cars. I like to use that example. You have a makes of cars like Toyota or Honda, or Ford or something like that, and then you would have the model, okay? That would be the value of the map, okay? Key and value. Key is the make, value is the model, okay? Now, I've spoken about this before. I'm just remembering now, back in our talk about data structures, and I've mentioned maps before, so I will say just that and use that as a reminder of what we talked about back when I was talking about data structures. A map, key value pair, is similar to a multidimensional array, and in my opinion, it's a better way to use or to organize data. I'd rather see data organized in a map rather than in a multi-dimensional array. So, again, my opinion, take that with a grain of salt if you like, but I've had to debug programs that used multi-dimensional arrays, and trust me, it's nightmarish. And it's a nightmare because the actual indexes that you use don't mean anything, okay? So what does position 3, 2 mean to you, okay? What does position 4, 7 mean to you? It doesn't mean anything, okay? Whereas when you have a map with a key and a value, the key could mean something. The key could be the make of a car, okay? Toyota makes sense. 05 doesn't, okay? So it puts some human aspect to the programming code itself, okay, when you use a map versus when you use a multi-dimensional array. Again, not because I wouldn't say that multi-dimensional arrays should never be used, because maybe there are uses where they would certainly shine, and I think in terms of a crossword puzzle that would make sense to use. So that's just my opinion on that particular subject. So it's been about half an hour of me talking now. Hopefully you have a good idea of what an array is and how you can use them, and the difference between an array and an array list, okay? Very important distinction between the two that you need to understand. I, again, will refer you to the howtoprogramwithjava.com/session8 show notes, okay? Those are the show notes. You can get them there. There will be the homework where you can read up on Java arrays and see the code for yourself, and how it looks and how you should use it. And I will leave you with that. So, to wrap things up, I will mention once more, I've got a fantastic new product that I've launched. at javavideotutorials.net. And it's a great compilation of videos that show you exactly how you can not only be a Java programmer, but how you can be a web programmer, okay? How you can build websites and use technologies like JavaScript and jQuery and Spring and Hibernate and databases, and it's just going to be cram-packed with all that great information that really is useful for building a really strong career as a programmer. So, I've even implemented, since the last podcast episode, I've put homework assignments into the Java video tutorials as well, and I've put actual tests in there too. So you'll have to actually read and go through a test, and it'd be a multiple choice test, I guess, and you'll have to pick through your answers, and if you don't pass, then you can't move on to the next video, okay? I'm penalizing you. You'll have to actually test your knowledge and prove to me that you understand the concepts that I'm teaching before you can move on, and I think it's great. I think it's something that's very unique, and I think it's just a fantastic way for you to really learn how to be just a great web developer. So by all means, check it out. You can sign up for an absolutely free version of it. You'll get a taste of the videos, you'll get a taste of the tests and the homework assignments and all that stuff. I'm even going to throw a forum in there where people can go talk and ask questions and get answers and talk amongst each other, and I really want to build up this great community that we have of people that are trying to learn how to program. So I want all of you to be very supportive of each other, and hop on over to javavideotutorials.net and check it out for yourself. All right? So until next time, have a great day, and happy learning.
Thanks for listening to the How to Program with Java podcast. Please visit howtoprogramwithjava.com for more useful Java tutorials.